and what exactly is safe firearm storage. So this topic came to me because there was a post on a Facebook group that I watch about safe storage of firearms. The post was referencing a video that was just made, and where one of the guys said, "Hey, my everyday carry goes on top of my fridge." Okay, that sounds very, mundane and boring and whatever. And this individual on this Facebook group said that he stopped listening after he said he had kids and the firearm goes on top of the fridge. And I thought that was very peculiar, right? Because my assumption is that this guy doesn't know the other guy. And the guy who has the firearm and puts it on top of his fridge probably knows his household, his children, his wife, all these things that would go into a risk assessment of putting a firearm on top of a fridge for storage. Okay, so let's say his children are 1 or 2, something like that. They can't climb, they can barely walk. The fridge might be a viable option. You know what I'm saying? Like, the top of the fridge might be a viable option. But as time goes on, the top of the fridge probably isn't a viable option. Obviously, right? When kids are curious, they're messing around with things, they're climbing all over things, they're doing things like that, the fridge is likely not a viable option. So there's that time period with children that they're just wild. They'll do whatever, anytime, doesn't matter what you say or how you say it, they're just out there. But then comes the training and the exposure. Okay, so let's think about this real quick. For those of you who have children, and let's say your kitchen knives, I guarantee you your kitchen knives aren't locked up in a safe somewhere. And one could argue that a kitchen knife can be just as dangerous as a firearm. Okay, one can argue that. But yet, we don't lock up our kitchen knives. What we do is what I hope people do anyway, is I hope people try to train the individual. So Dylan DeRoll, I'm talking about training or at least educating children on firearms. If you have firearms in the house, or if you don't have firearms in the house and you want firearms or whatever, I'm talking about training or educating your children on firearms just as much as you would train your children on knives or something of that nature. That's what I'm talking about. So the storage of firearms can change over time. Okay, so let's take a lifetime of an individual. Let's say I'm going to use my life for example. Okay, when I was a young adult, let's say in my 20s, I didn't have any children. I was by myself. So a storage of that firearm that I had on top of the fridge or out in the open somewhere in my home is perfectly fine. It's acceptable. Now, I get married. Okay? Well, then I have to think, well, is my wife a fugitive or not fugitive? Excuse me. Is my wife a prohibited person to possess a firearm? Right? Because if I was knowingly letting her have the firearm as a prohibited person, then now I can be liable. So I got to think about that. But let's say she's not a prohibited person. Still, yet, with no children, having a firearm out in the open in my home, my own home, is completely fine and is acceptable. Now, let's say we have a child. 1, 2, maybe 3 years of age, maybe, we need to start talking about, okay, where the hell are we going to put this firearm at? Do we need to get a safe? Do we need to get a lockbox? Do we need to get, what do we need to do? Do we need to keep it unloaded, right? Is the trigger pull really hard, or do I have like a light trigger pull? Like a bunch of different things, right? When we're talking about storage of a firearm, when it comes to small children. Now you have the 3, 4. Yeah, there's some overlapping here. Then you have your 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You have that time period where children are very curious about things, and you as a parent or parents have to determine when it is time to expose the child to firearms, as in on the range, and teaching them firearm safety. Now, this can fluctuate between from one child to another child. It can also fluctuate between how good the instructor is. Now, if it's a father teaching their son, okay, cool. But at a certain point, you kind of need a professional to get in there with your child to teach them the correct way. You ever heard the slogan, "This ain't your daddy's shotgun"? Well, there's a reason why that's a slogan, right? Because sometimes the daddy isn't very good with a shotgun either, right? And so that daddy is also teaching his son, and then his son thinks he's some kind of expert or gee whiz guy with a shotgun or a pistol or whatever. And then you get these false positives where the individual thinks they're really, really good with a firearm. They know everything about firearms and they're experts and so on and so forth. But they're not. They're not. I know that. Why do I know that? Because I used to be that guy. I used to be the guy that thought, I knew everything. I was young, dumb, and full of you know what. Okay? Now that I'm over 40, I've had several people to emulate that are astounding people, just great people in the special operations community and the like. So I used to be that guy, so I know what that guy thinks like. Most people have no idea what the fuck a firearm is, right? They just don't know. They think they know, but they don't know. They think when they go to the range and they're shooting a firearm at 4 or 5 or 7 yards and they're hitting an E-type target, just a huge target, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm good. Well, that's not true. And mistakes can happen with anyone. So, back on the subject at hand. Storage of firearms fluctuates throughout your life. So now we go back to that 10-year-old. If an individual, if like for example myself, my son is going to be 21 in March. I had trained him since he was 5. 5 years old with a Walther P22 in North Carolina. I was training my son, and it was a one-on-one instruction. One-on-one instruction. I was teaching him how to draw. I was teaching him how to put it on fire, how to put it on safe. I was teaching him all those things, right? Now, that doesn't mean that I just give him free rein to my firearm. At that point in time, since he was 5 years old, yeah, I was training him these safety rules and, clearing the firearm, such as dropping the source of feed, placing the firearm safe, pulling the action to the rear, examining the cartridge, eject and extract, looking in the chamber, the bolt face, and the magazine well, letting the slide go forward, pointing the firearm down range, and making a well-aimed dry fire shot into the berm before we store it, for example. I was teaching him these things, but he was 5 years old. You see, so being just trained, quote unquote, wasn't enough. You still have to have the maturity. You have to understand safety from danger. So we're talking about children here. They don't really grasp the concept of safety and danger until about, in my personal opinion, until about 7 to 10 years old. 7 to 10 years old. So, but that doesn't mean you start training them at that time. You start training them beforehand. You start saying, hey, this is a firearm. That's the business end. Don't put the business end anywhere you don't want to, shoot, for example. Here's your safety. Here's the magazine release. Here's the magazine. Here's the bullets. Like all these other things, right? But I still put it in a safe, in a lockbox, unloaded, because that wasn't my everyday carry, for example. And that was the best way to do it at that point in time. Now, about the age of, for me personally, right, this is going to be different for every parent and every child, right? There's going to be, even within the home, right? You could have 2 or 3 children, and you might have to do a risk assessment, or you should do a risk assessment for each and every child on how you're going to store the firearm. You might have a switched on child, and if you're not paying attention, they find out the code to your safe, for example, because you've gotten your safe, and they can remember how you did it, and then they can get in there, right? Which brings me back to the training aspect of it. If you start training them early with a very low-powered firearm, such as a 22, 17 HMR, maybe even a BB gun, okay? You start teaching those safety aspects. They're going to be easier to teach later on, even more things. So back to my son, right? About the age of 15, him and I, we built an AR-15, and that was his firearm. That was his gun. And with looking at the law in Colorado and all this other stuff, right? That's another aspect of safe storage, right? Because you got another law. I determined, I told him, I said, hey, we're going to hang your firearm on the wall, and the magazine is going to be in this particular location, which he had access to, because I made that risk assessment of my child that he was well trained and good to go, and he was only going to use that firearm if he ever had to in defense of the home. Because I had observed him, I knew who he was. I've trained him. I've watched his safety habits with the firearm. I made that determination. Now, let's say I was wrong in my determination and something was to happen and my son was involved. Yeah, I could be held liable for that. I took that responsibility on myself. He's almost 21 years old. He lives in another state. He's doing his own thing. I have no doubt that he will be an excellent firearms owner and safety, and adhere to all the safety things that I've taught him over the years. So the point to this whole is it's not about just locking up your firearms. If you just lock up your firearms and never allow your children to go and shoot them and learn safety things, when they become older,